At the wind market, a random Earth melody caused the auto-translator to erupt in mechanical laughter, having identified the simple rhythm as a direct military blood oath. This bizarre malfunction instantly triggered a memory wipe protocol for the last 24 hours, completely sealing off the trading rows with emergency blast shields. Cut off from his ship, the rescuer Atlas soon discovered that his own old injury had been cynically factored in by the clients of the deadly, live cargo. To extract a local predator and a disgraced alien specialist from the trap, the Earthman would have to pit nothing more than quiet, terrifying human endurance against the dome's merciless hydraulics. The air of the wind market hummed with constant drafts and smelled thickly of the sour ammonia of alien business deals. The rescuer Atlas stood by the loading terminal, shaking gray dust off his old quarter-folded paper map. Killing time, he began quietly whistling a catchy Earth tune. It was a simple, rhythmic song he had heard long before his last, disastrous landing. Standing nearby, the alien specialist named Narshi flinched sharply. His auto-translator, fastened to his narrow chest, suddenly burst into a continuous, ear-splitting synthetic laugh, instead of its usual monotonous hum. Normal silent trade was going on all around them. The locals inhabiting the domes of the windmill moon wasted no time on words. They closed contracts through sharp scent bursts and curt gestures. The trader's skin color shifted constantly, from businesslike green to aggressive crimson, marking terms and prices. Human-heavy clothing seemed to them like a death mask, deliberately concealing true intentions. But the translator's laughter did not stop. It sounded flat, mechanical, drowning out the hum of the giant fans. The system had captured the sound pattern of the Earth melody and, for some reason, classified it as a direct military blood oath. Narshi's skin broke out in ashen-gray blotches. For his species, that shade meant absolute, uncontrollable terror. The alien tried to strike the device's box to silence the speaker, but it was already too late. Somewhere high under the dome, heavy metal clanged. The crowd froze instantly, their skin flashing in unison to a single muddy yellow shade of panic. Emergency blast shields, thick slabs of armor plating, crashed down from the ceiling with a deafening roar. They slammed into the deck, kicking up clouds of acrid dust and completely cutting the trading rows off from the dock exits. A cold voice from hidden speakers drowned out the rising roar of the crowd. In standard trade, the automated system announced a complete sector lockdown. Citing the threat of a mass slaughter, the system had initiated patrol deployment for the forced memory wipe of all incident witnesses. No hearings, no trials, just a complete erasure of the last 24 hours for everyone caught in the quarantine zone. Atlas clenched his teeth. His memories of the past expedition, of the people he couldn't pull out of the rubble, were heavy, soaked with guilt. But he had no intention of surrendering that pain to the local soulless automatics. It was his burden, and he alone would decide how to carry it. Narshi grasped the scale of the catastrophe faster. The alien, whose reputation was being destroyed before the entire market's eyes by an equipment failure, lunged toward the wall. An old technical hatch was hidden behind the stacks of containers. Narshi gripped the turn lever with his long fingers, trying to open the passage before the patrol drones armed with paralyzers entered the sector. The lever wouldn't budge. The mechanism had long been jammed by condensation and caked dust. Narshi threw his entire slender body against it, trying to force through the rust. The alien's skin began darkening rapidly, flooding with a deep violet color. This was the color of profound shame and helplessness. He was choking, his feet sliding on the smooth plastic floor. Atlas stepped toward the wall, assessing the situation. "Step aside," the rescuer said curtly. Narshi only pressed himself tighter against the panel, shielding it with his back. The alien was physically incapable of budging the cold metal, but admitting weakness in front of the human would mean a complete loss of face for him. He hissed, splaying his thin arms wide as if shielding his own trap. From beyond the lowered blast doors, the rhythmic stomp of the patrol's heavy boots was already closing in. The pressure was mounting. There was no time to argue. Atlas stepped forward, moved in close, and stood shoulder to shoulder with Narshi. He did not push the alien aside. Instead, the human calmly laid his broad, calloused palms over Narshi's trembling fingers on the handle. "Hold tight," Atlas said in an even, quiet voice. "I'm just backing you up. We pull together." The human exhaled slowly, braced his boots against the seam of the floor plates, and engaged every ounce of his stubborn, earthborn endurance. The muscles of his back tensed beneath the thick fabric of his jacket. Atlas did not yank the lever toward himself, risking a stripped mechanism. He began to press down smoothly, continuously, absorbing 90% of the resistance onto his own shoulders. To any trader who might have looked at them now through the settling dust, it would have seemed as if the tall Narshi was forcing the stubborn mechanism himself, while the stocky Earthman merely laid his hands on top for show. Something inside the door frame gave a dry crunch. The metal grated downward. Narshi drew a sharp breath, and his skin instantly lightened, returning to a calm green hue. The alien twisted the freed locking bolt, and the heavy panel hissed into its slot. They tumbled into the dark tech sector a couple of seconds before the first silhouettes of the cleanup crew burst into the trading row. Without looking, Atlas slammed his fist against the emergency closure panel on the inner side. The airlock clanged into place. A thick silence hung in the cramped corridor, broken only by Narshi's ragged, whistling breath. The electronics here, behind the thick shielding plates, were dead. All contact with the port was completely severed. The rescuer leaned against the cold wall, feeling the ache in his overstrained forearms. He pulled the folded port map from his pocket and clicked on his portable flashlight. A dim beam of light fell onto the dense paper. Over the outdated printed schematics, someone's hand had crudely inked a network of ventilation shafts and bypass routes. Narshi glanced sideways at the map. His broken auto-translator emitted a short wheeze and went completely silent, leaving an unspoken question hanging in the air as to why the automatics had responded with laughter to a random song. Atlas traced a dirty finger along the ink line that led them deeper into the tech labyrinth. Staying here was pointless, and the direct path to freedom was now blocked by heavy blast shields. In the dead-end tech corridor, sound died heavily, settling viscously onto the rusted pipes. The silence that followed after the heavy airlock cut them off from the trading rows pressed against their ears. Atlas stood, leaning against the cold wall, steadily sweeping the beam of his portable flashlight over the curved lines on the old paper. The escape route, sketched by hand with someone's hurried pen, looked tangled, but it promised a bypass beyond the sealed-off zone. A sudden metallic screech tore through the silence, making the human jerk his head up. The sound came from deep within the narrow passage. In the dense shadows, barely touched by the dim light, loomed a mangled cargo container. It was wedged between the massive pipes of the cooling system. One side crumpled so unnaturally, it looked as if a landing module had been dropped onto it. Inside, something was thudding methodically, dully, against the jammed wall. Narshi twitched with his entire narrow frame. In the flashlight's beam, the alien specialist's skin rapidly lost its calm green hue, breaking out in acid-yellow blotches of sharp warning. He waved his long, three-fingered hands, demanding that the light be killed immediately, his whole demeanor screaming that they needed to leave right now. The unspoken local laws of the wind market were brutally simple. Anyone who got into trouble was already considered dead. Interfering meant voluntarily sharing the status of prey. Narshi pointed sharply at the deformed crate, then drew the edge of his palm across his own chest. The gesture needed no translation from a dictionary. That was where the problem lay. A local outcast, meant to be left to rot in the trap. Atlas lowered the map. The screech of metal repeated, this time much weaker, fading into a long, ragged exhale. It was the sound of utter exhaustion. The rescuer's memory helpfully served up a vivid, nauseatingly clear image from his last deployment. Cracked ground, a ventilation shaft buried under rock, and the tiny blue pulse indicators of his team members. They had winked out one by one on his wrist display, while he methodically, strictly by protocol, tried to break through the stone with a weak hand drill. Back then, he had followed the safety regulations right up to the very last second. He had waited for official reinforcements, which arrived 2 long hours too late. The human jammed the flat flashlight between his teeth and stepped toward the stuck cargo. The yellow blotches on Narshi's face darkened, shifting into an aggressive, seething crimson pattern. The alien tried to block his path, spreading his long fingers wide, hoping to stop the madman. But Atlas simply moved him aside with a broad shoulder, never even breaking his steady stride. The mangled metal of the container's lid was jammed shut for good. The thick support hinges had bent at an unnatural angle, fused into their slots. Atlas slid his calloused fingers into the narrow gap between the deformed hatch and the main body. The cold edge bit painfully into his flesh. The rescuer braced his heavy boots against the seam of the plastic floor plates, exhaled through clenched jaws, and pulled the immovable lid toward himself. The muscles of his back and forearms strained taut under the fabric of his jacket, trembling from the extreme tension. A loud, dry crack of snapping anchor bolts rang out, and the heavy panel shifted aside with a screech. Inside, crammed into an unnaturally tight space between bent beams, was a massive creature. Its body, covered in rigid horny plates, was pinned down tightly by the collapsed upper section of the crate. A sharp edge of torn metal had locked the beast's hind limb in a death grip, leaving it not a single chance of getting free on its own. The creature was exhausted and clearly wounded. Its short movements seemed jerky, constrained by waves of rising pain. But the moment the beam of light fell on its broad muzzle, the beast immediately bared a double row of short fangs. Seeing the tall, slender figure of Narshi behind the human, the outcast let out a low hiss. It tried to straighten up, ignoring its trapped leg, in an effort to appear larger and more dangerous. The pride of a local predator would not allow it to show vulnerability in front of a representative of a more successful race. Every sharp movement caused it unbearable agony, yet it kept snarling threateningly, ready to bleed out in the trap rather than accept charity from the arrogant market regulars. Atlas grasped the internal mechanics of this mute standoff instantly. If he tried to pull the beast out by force, the creature would perceive it as a direct attack and go for his throat to preserve its honor. If Narshi took so much as a step closer to offer help, it would be a public humiliation for the predator. The rescuer spat the flashlight into his palm and secured it on his shoulder clip. He did not reach out to the creature with empty hands, did not try to make soothing sounds or demonstrate superiority. Instead, the human squeezed inside the twisted crate, risking being trapped himself, and stood with his back to the snarling predator. He wedged his right shoulder deep under the sagging metal beam, whose mass was pressing the animal into the floor. Narshi clicked his joints indignantly, his smooth skin rapidly taking on a shade of cold bewilderment. To the alien's logic, the Earthman's actions looked like utterly senseless suicide. Atlas took one deep, measured breath, bent his knees at a right angle, and began to straighten up slowly. The weight of the collapsed ceiling crashed down onto his collarbone with all its monstrous mass. The metal groaned in protest. The Earthman froze for a long second, allowing his spine to adapt to the colossal pressure, then made one more short, incredibly stubborn effort upward. His face flushed red, thick veins in his neck standing out clearly under the skin. The soles of his boots slipped on smooth plastic until they found a reliable foothold in a rusty seam. He was not trying to push the beam aside. The human lifted it only those measly 15 centimeters needed for the release. The creature abruptly stopped hissing. Its dark, faceted eyes focused on the tense, rock-solid back of the man. The outcast instantly understood the proposed terms. This was not a rescue from a position of condescending strength. The man did not demand gratitude nor look at him. He simply became a living mechanism, a temporary, silent support. The beast pulled its freed limb in. It moved heavily, shifting weight onto its healthy paws, but fully preserving its dignity. Squeezing past Atlas's trembling legs, the creature crawled out. It stood heavily in the corridor, casting a short, direct look at the retreating Narshi. The beast stood on its own. No one had seen it weak. A strange, silent point of trust was sealed. Atlas exhaled sharply, sidestepped, and let the heavy beam crash down with devastating force. The human rolled out of the empty container, breathing heavily. The loud clang of metal on metal echoed through the web of ventilation shafts. For one long second nothing happened, and then high under the corridor's vault, dim red indicators flickered on. The autonomous sensors of the tech sector instantly reacted to the sharp acoustic surge. From invisible grills in the walls, Thick, acrid gas billowed out with a quiet, steady hiss. It spread across the floor in an impenetrable white carpet, quickly filling the enclosed space. The automation had mercilessly activated the full sterilization protocol for blind zones. Narshi clutched his throat convulsively. His skin broke out in ashen gray blotches of animal terror. The alien backed against the wall, but the direct path back had long been cut off by massive emergency blast shields. The rescued creature growled hoarsely, shifting its injured paw, and instinctively pressed its hard shoulder against the human's leg, seeking protection. Now they were all inside a new trap. Atlas coughed from the first sour gulp of gas. He stubbornly wiped the sweat from his forehead with a dirty sleeve, and with a sharp movement, unfolded the crumpled old paper map right on his knee. The flashlight beam once again caught the crooked ink line, leading them further into the saving labyrinth. The man nodded briefly toward the dark chasm of a pipe ahead, rose to his feet, and took the first step. The white sterilizing gas seeped through the lower grills of the ventilation manifold, forcing the trio of fugitives to crawl along the narrow metal duct without a single stop. The corrosive substance smelled of burnt lime and settled on mucous membranes, causing a dry, painful cough. Atlas moved first, illuminating the path with the dim beam of his shoulder flashlight, and constantly checking the handwritten notes on the old paper map folded into quarters. His left hand convulsively clutched the stained sheet, while his right methodically pulled his heavy body along the corrugated plastic. Behind him, gasping heavily for breath, Narshi moved, and the rescued creature brought up the rear of the column. The beast was clearly suffering from its previously trapped paw, its claws scraping against the deck with every awkward movement. But the sticky fear of being left alone inside the dense gas cloud drove the local predator forward more strongly than its basic instinct for self-preservation. Ahead, the manifold duct narrowed sharply, blocked halfway by a deformed emergency shutter. The thick metal had been warped by some powerful old impact, leaving only a narrow gap that a man in a heavy jacket physically could not squeeze through. Atlas braced his shoulder against the obstacle, trying to force the stubborn mechanism aside, but the jammed hinges wouldn't budge a single millimeter. The rescuer began frantically searching for an alternate route along the ink lines of the map, when a massive bulk roughly pushed him aside. The beast shoved its way forward, completely ignoring Narshi's protesting hiss, and pressed its back, covered in rigid horny plates, against the jammed shutter. The predator braced its healthy paws against the opposite wall of the pipe and, with a low guttural growl, began slowly straightening its spine. The rusted metal groaned in a long, drawn-out screech, yielding to the desperate pressure of raw muscle mass. The creature widened the passage just enough for the human to crawl through after it, and froze, holding the shutter open with its own weight, until Atlas and the alien specialist were on the safe side. The manifold led them into a small tech expansion, the shielded pocket of an old emergency communications system. Behind thick layers of lead insulation, the hum of the dome's giant fans and the hiss of the toxic gas seemed muffled, almost unreal. Against the far wall of the room, the autonomous stationary terminal of the port flickered dimly with standby light, having somehow miraculously retained local power after the general lockdown. Narshi immediately lunged for the panel, pulling a long interface cable from his wrist-mounted bracer. His thin fingers quickly settled on the sensors, trying to reroute the magnetic locks on the path to the main airlock. The alien specialist understood perfectly well that without direct access to the electronic schematics of the ventilation nodes, they would sooner or later suffocate in the next dead end. The terminal screen flickered, responding to the rapid command input, but instead of the standard sector navigation charts, the system suddenly dumped a solid mass of blocked data. Narshi froze over the console for a second. His personal equipment, connected directly to the port, had bypassed the external security layers and requested routing, but the local logic responded by pulling up the hidden freight logs onto the display, the very reason the Earthman had come to the wind market. The specialist quickly scrolled through the technical parameters of the cargo and stumbled upon the sealed profile of the hired courier. The text was composed in the standard trade language, comprehensible to any local race. The smooth skin of Narshi began to rapidly change color. The calm green hue dissolved, giving way to a murky, leaden gray tone. On this windmill moon, such a color signified not just fear or situational shame. It was a marker of total alienation and deep existential suspicion toward the partner standing beside him. The alien was reading a dry, analytical extract from the human's personal dossier. Several paragraphs detailed the past failure of the Earth expedition, the death of the team under a mountain collapse, and the precise psychological defect of the surviving rescuer. At the very bottom of the screen, a short, cynical resolution from the cargo senders burned brightly. It stated that this subject was easily manipulated through direct stimulation of a guilt complex, and in a critical situation was guaranteed to choose a suicidal rescue attempt over any prescribed safety protocol. Narshi spun sharply toward the Earthman, striking the glass of the monitor right over the glowing letters with 3 rigid fingers. He could not voice the accusation aloud due to the dead auto-translator on his chest, but his ragged, aggressive gestures were perfectly clear. Narshi pointed at the text, then at Atlas, demanding an answer. The Earthman turned out to be no honorable mercenary with a strict code of conduct, but a broken psychological instrument whose blind need to crawl into a death trap had been pre-calculated by the clients and cynically woven into their delivery logistics. Atlas walked slowly to the terminal and scanned the translated lines. The muscles on his jaw tightened, his heavy, calloused palms involuntarily clenched into fists. He could have tried to explain to the alien that he knew nothing about the file's contents, that he really had been hired blind, that the sweat-stained paper map was the only real guidance he had been issued before the flight. But the rescuer remained silent. His heavy, muffled silence proved to be the worst possible confirmation. Atlas refused to defend himself or invent convenient excuses because the dry analytics on the flickering screen were absolutely accurate. The unknown employer had struck at his most vulnerable spot. The Earthman had indeed reached into that mangled cargo container with his bare hands, precisely because he could not let someone die in the cramped darkness a second time in his life. The man simply lowered his eyes, accepting this cruel truth about himself, and brushed the gray dust from his jacket sleeve. The dangerous local creature, standing in the dense shadows of the pipes, had unerringly sensed the sharp social aggression emanating from the specialist's gray skin. The beast could not read system logs on a monitor and did not understand the backstory of the Earth contract, but it could perfectly read the power dynamics in the cramped room. The outcast let out a low growl, bared a double row of short fangs, and took a single, heavy, measured step toward the human. It stood directly between Atlas and Narshi, rigidly fixing its position. The local predator deliberately shielded with its body the one who had recently put his shoulder under a falling metal beam. This was no instinctive attempt to tear the alien specialist to pieces. It was a physical boundary of protection, the first point of a debt, which the proud beast had acknowledged voluntarily and intended to uphold. A sudden heavy slam of automation behind them shook the metal floor of the tech expansion. The ventilation shaft from which they had just climbed was sealed with a deafening clang by a massive emergency hermetic seal. The dome's security systems had detected a critical spread of corrosive gas through the pipes and had completely sealed off the contaminated zone with thick, multi-layered armor. The air pressure in the shielded pockets spiked sharply, painfully popping their eardrums. The physical point of no return had been definitively crossed. The way back no longer existed even in theory, cutting off any retreat to the safe trading levels of the market. Narshi twitched convulsively at the sound of the closing steel trap. His lead-gray skin rippled with fine, nervous tremors at the realization of the problem's scale. The alien found himself locked in an isolated dark labyrinth with an aggressive predator and a human whose behavior was entirely controlled by outside manipulation. Trust within the makeshift group had been shattered to its very foundation. Atlas silently turned away from the dead terminal, raised his flashlight, and directed the dim beam onto the unfolded map, cross-checking the ink lines with the dark maw of the next transit corridor. The Earthman slung the strap over his shoulder and trudged heavily toward the exit, leading them further on toward the dome's main airlock. The beast, limping slightly on its wounded leg, immediately followed him. Narshi waited several long seconds, then also stepped into the void of the passageway. Now the alien specialist kept to the opposite wall, at the maximum possible distance from the human, broadcasting through his skin the color of deep, insurmountable hostility. But the old paper map remained in the Earthman's hands, and it was the only remaining bridge forcing them to move into the darkness together. The central distribution hub beneath the wind turbine turned out to be an enormous shaft tangled with thick power cables. The air here was dry, dense, and saturated with the smell of overheated ozone. Rows of wide service panels flickered continuously, with cascades of alarm indicators. The external patrols had already broken through to the main servers and launched a harsh protocol for total erasure of the local databases. Entire sectors of the navigation grid on the displays were going dark, one after another. Atlas approached the nearest terminal, wiped a layer of gray dust from the heated glass, and unfolded his old paper map, creased into quarters. He urgently needed to match the crooked ink lines of the routes with the flickering codes on the screens. The moment the human rested his hands on the console, the system rippled red. The automatics reached out to delete their sector. Narshi, who a second ago had been keeping to the wall with icy hostility, lunged sharply forward. The alien specialist reflexively hammered a series of rigid commands with his long fingers, initiating a hardware freeze of the interface. This was not an act of truce with the human. Simply put, without the navigation architecture, they would instantly become blind, dead men walking in a locked labyrinth. The system screeched loudly with its physical drives, trying to bypass the block, and spat the hidden freight specifications onto the central screen. These were the logs of the very cargo Atlas was supposed to pick up at the docks before the quarantine. The Earthman and the alien specialist simultaneously peered at the scrolling lines. The text was displayed in standard trade language. The official declaration listed neither rare ores nor contraband electronics. The document detailed the complex conditions of cryogenic support, the precise composition of synthetic nutrient mixtures, and the critical temperature regimes for transporting living organic matter. The system was requesting preparation of life support modules for embryos and several adult specimens. It was an endangered local species. The very species of predator whose massive representative was now shifting heavily on its wounded leg directly behind their backs. The hired Earthship was meant to transport not a commercial commodity. The cargo was an encrypted distress signal and the last line of evacuation for doomed beings. Narshi's eyes darted frantically across the lines of the display, where the sender's identifiers had lit up. His three-fingered hands froze above the sensors. He clearly saw the digital signatures, the hidden ciphers of the highest trade leadership of his own race at the market. The very elites who had deliberately hired a human with a calculated guilt complex were themselves the initiators of the covert purge. The upper echelon was cynically writing off the endangered species as unprofitable scrap, completely blocking all official channels of aid for them. And at the same moment, they had cold-bloodedly set up their own specialist to be erased by the blind memory purge. The scattered facts converged into one harsh, logical line. It became clear why the alien's Auto-Translator had recently burst into continuous laughter. The device had not malfunctioned because of the rhythm of the Earth song. Its built-in intelligence had detected, in the sound pattern of the melody, a frequency that matched a critical marker of a massive official conspiracy. The algorithm simply could not process a situation in which the leadership was deliberately destroying its own allies, and it output systemic absurdity in the form of synthetic hysteria. The alien's narrow shoulders slumped heavily. The hostility toward the Earthman lost all meaning the second his own leadership made them identical targets. Narshi clenched his fists in helplessness, but did not manage to take a single step away from the console. The dome's external wind turbine, switched by the automatics into emergency lockdown mode, could not withstand the mounting pressure. With a deafening screech, it transmitted a monstrous mechanical vibration to the support structures of the hub. The metal floor abruptly dropped from beneath their feet. At the end of the long hall, the main decompression lock deformed with a protracted groan. The thick, armored shutters began to slowly slide apart under colossal external pressure, forming a jagged gap. A vacuum draft surged into the room with a piercing howl, sucking out the breathable oxygen. The safety automatics, programmed to purge the sector's memory banks, completely ignored the critical breach of the hermetic seal. The force of the reverse thrust grew rapidly, tearing small debris from the consoles. Narshi instantly assessed the lethal trajectory of the airflow. The alien lunged toward the chamber shutters and latched onto the heavy lever for emergency manual closing with a death grip. His long legs slid desperately across the metal deck, unable to find a reliable foothold. He threw his entire angular body onto the handle, trying to force the jammed mechanism back into its locking groove by sheer strength. The rusty metal screeched piercingly, refusing to yield. The pressure of the inrushing air mercilessly wrenched at the alien's joints. Narshe physically could not scream, but the bulging, rigid veins on his neck made it clear he was operating far beyond the limits of his physiology. He risked being maimed or hurled into the shaft, but he would not release the immovable lever. Rage at his own treacherous leadership refused to let him step aside or signal for help. Atlas wasted no seconds on risk analysis. The rescuer silently stepped forward, tilting his head into the gale force draft. He moved in close to the suffocating alien specialist, positioning himself so as not to push him away from the control panel, and firmly seized the rebellious handle with two broad, calloused palms directly beneath Narshe's trembling fingers. The Earthman planted his heavy boots securely against the seam of the floor plates, shifted the main load onto his lower back, and smoothly pulled the shutter toward himself. There was no demonstration of species superiority or condescending rescue in this gesture. Two specialists were simply sharing a physical burden to preserve lives. Behind them came the heavy scrape of claws. The massive beast, ignoring the pain in its crippled paw, squeezed its way toward the deformed lock. The local predator let out a low growl, pressed its hard, horny carapace against the stubborn lever from the opposite side, and added its mass to their combined effort. Three utterly different creatures formed a rigid triangle of trust, maintaining the hub's pressure seal. With a dry clang, the bent lock shutter shifted and settled heavily into the deep locking groove. The piercing vacuum whistle cut off instantly, leaving only the steady hum of overloaded cables and the ragged breathing of the trio in the hall. Atlas slowly unclenched his fingers, released the cold lever, and wiped his forehead with the stiff sleeve of his jacket. On the flickering terminal screen, the global database purge indicator had inexorably approached its critical mark. Only a few minutes remained until the complete memory wipe of the sector was finished. The human pulled the crumpled paper map from his pocket and smoothed it out again right on his knee, cross-checking the surviving data. All the bypass routes drawn in ink lines ended in dead-end cul-de-sacs. The single working navigation code Narshe had managed to extract from the system before it froze led them straight to the distribution core. Now the escape route for the live cargo demanded the total physical destruction of the automatics controlling the entire dome. The terminal screens behind their backs flickered in unison and went dark forever. The purge process completed, plunging the hub into the dense twilight of weak emergency lighting. But the truth had already been extracted from the system. Narshe slowly stepped back from the blocked lock and looked directly at the human for the first time. No more alienation could be read in his straightened posture. A common enemy had leveled their statuses. Atlas folded the old map along its worn creases and shoved it deep into the inner pocket of his jacket. The choice lay before him as an absolutely clear fact. He could try to leave quietly, fulfilling the basic job of preserving his own life, and allow an endangered species to finally perish in the blocked containers of the market. Or he could disregard his own drilled-in rules and risk everything to protect a life not his own. The Earthman silently adjusted the slipped strap of his shoulder flashlight, turned toward the dark gap of the corridor, and took the first heavy step forward. The beast and the alien specialist moved after him in unison. The central distribution hub of the wind market met the fugitives with a thick, suffocating smell of overheated insulation and a subtle, building vibration. This tremor came directly from under the heavy metal floor plates, resonating in the soles of their boots. The sector had not yet plunged into complete darkness, but long rows of emergency lamps were already flickering chaotically, signaling the death throes of the local system. The external patrols were methodically burning the databases, and the core remained the last frontier before the dome's total shutdown. Atlas walked first. His breathing remained steady as he checked the route against the old paper map, stained with machine oil and ink. The path to the main power lines led through a wide technical arch, blocked by a thick, armored blast shield. As soon as the human's boot crossed the invisible line of infrared sensors, A short, ear-splitting alarm wailed under the hall's ceiling. The safety automatics, configured for total concealment of the incident's evidence, had detected a living presence in the sterilized zone. Inside the concrete walls, hydraulic presses awoke with a deafening clang. The massive steel gate screeched and began crawling down, slowly, inexorably, crushing its own time-jammed hinges. This soulless mechanism was right now cutting off Narshi and the massive predator from the main power node, leaving them trapped in a dead end. The heavy beast reacted first, driven by the basic instinct of immediate resistance to a snapping trap. The predator lunged forward sharply, completely ignoring the shooting pain in its previously injured paw. With a muffled, vibrating growl, it braced its healthy forelimbs against the descending edge of the cold metal. The outcast genuinely tried to stop the multi-ton blast shield with brute muscular strength, but the hydraulics did not even slow their lethal course. The thick horned claws screeched and slid across the smooth surface, leaving behind 4 deep, gleaming furrows. The creature hissed in fury at its own helplessness. The rigid plates on its back tensed dangerously, but the gate continued to press it relentlessly toward the floor, forcing its broad muzzle down. Atlas did not waste precious seconds on shouts, commands, or attempts to coordinate their actions. Any words were useless now. The human simply stepped close to the wall and pulled his old, worn paper map from the inner pocket of his jacket. He quickly and firmly rolled the dense, sweat-soaked sheet into a tight, multi-layered cylinder. The rescuer squeezed into the narrowing gap, stood directly under the descending steel guillotine, and placed the paper wad on his left shoulder. It was the only shock-absorbing pad between his fragile bones and the inexorable machine pressure. Then the Earthman grabbed the stubborn manual lever of the emergency stop and smoothly positioned his back under the pressing weight of the structure. He took on himself 100% of the monstrous load. Atlas did this in absolute, ringing silence. No dramatic heaves, no heroic groans that could sound like a reproach of weakness. He simply turned himself into a living, stubborn support, taking the weight onto his spine. This allowed the proud predator to release its trembling, overstrained paws and step back without losing face in front of the alien specialist. The creature exhaled noisily, cast a short, attentive glance at the human's stone-cold face, and quickly slipped through the narrowing crack toward the power cables of the core. Narshi darted after it, his long, angular shoulders barely missing the cold metal edge. The alien specialist realized with terrifying clarity that the Merciless automatics would now physically crush the Earthman and seal them in this shielded pocket forever. The animal fear of being left in absolute isolation inside a blocked sector instantly united the refined trader from the upper levels and the wild outcast. Narshi flew to the open distribution panels. His thin, 3-fingered hands began tearing the plastic protective covers off the main lines with feverish speed. The beast heaved itself up beside him. The local predator had absolutely no understanding of electronics, but its jaws and claws easily bit through the thick polymer insulation where the specialist's fingers merely slipped and could not tear apart the tangle of wires. Together, they began roughly and with desperate haste rerouting the thick power cables. The hydraulic pressure above the human's head was building with every second. The market's mechanism knew no fatigue and no pain. Its pumps continued methodically pumping excess pressure to complete the lockdown protocol. Atlas stood with his feet shoulder-width apart, his heavy boots planted rigidly against the ribbed plastic of the floor. The paper map on his shoulder was already soaked through with acrid sweat and blood from burst capillaries, finally transformed into a filthy wad. The muscles of his back and forearms stretched beneath the fabric of his jacket to the very limit of tearing. In the ringing silence of the archway, the first dry, distinct crack of overstressed human joints rang out. The rescuer bit his lip until it hurt, tasting a warm, metallic tang on his tongue. His breathing had finally broken down into short, rasping gasps. His vision began to rapidly darken, and his memory helpfully conjured up a sickeningly vivid picture from a past expedition. That very same dead-end cave-in a ruined mine, where the fractured rock proved too heavy, and his own arms too weak to lift the weight and pull his suffocating team out. That old, undigested guilt was working now as absolutely pure fuel. He categorically refused to retreat a second time. Atlas slowly exhaled air through clenched teeth, forcing his trembling knees to stay straight. He was physically breaking himself, consciously turning his own body into a jammed bolt inside the soulless machine. It was at precisely this moment that the local automatics of the hub, confronted with the unforeseen critical resistance of the valve and the simultaneous violent interference with the cables, produced a deep system failure. The safety algorithms attempted to reroute the excess energy and accidentally broadcast the live feed from the internal service cameras onto the surviving giant screens of the wind market's outer perimeter. There, above the blocked trading rows, where hundreds of local traders were waiting in mute panic for the forced memory purge, a sharp image suddenly appeared from the very heart of the dome. The vast crowd instantly froze. Their smooth skin, which had been shimmering with shades of muddy yellow fear, began rapidly shifting color to a deep, shocked, dark blue hue. The entire market watched live as the stocky human in rugged clothing, which they had always considered a deceitful mask, took upon his own bones the colossal weight of the emergency hydraulics. They clearly saw how the Earthman, silently, without a single gesture of aggression, an attempt to bargain or a plea for help, shielded the backs of an endangered predator and a disgraced specialist. Human endurance was not an advertising myth for cheap contracts. It looked quiet, ugly, and terrifyingly stubborn. Before the eyes of the entire dome, Narshi and the local outcasts together desperately tore at the sparking power circuits, while the human bought them precious seconds at the cost of his own spinal column's integrity. The political reality of the market changed in one short moment. No one from the higher leadership could now publicly claim that this live cargo was merely commercial waste, and the hired Earthman a manageable, broken tool. The system failure ripped away all the veils, turning the secret purge into a public spectacle. The metal began inexorably pressing the weakening man's shoulders downward. The heavy boots of the rescuer slowly slid across the smooth plastic, leaving black streaks of ground-down rubber behind them. The sharp edge of the deformed flap pierced the protective paper wad and bit painfully into the straining flesh. The rescuer's knees trembled violently, bending that first critical inch. The pressure closed in on the threshold beyond which load-bearing bones inevitably shatter into splinters. Atlas squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the final crushing blow from above. Far behind his back, a direct current discharge boomed heavily. The cables, rerouted by the alien specialist and the beast, erupted in a blindingly bright sheaf of dense blue sparks. The thick wires shorted out, instantly burning through the heavy mainline fuses across the entire tech level. The hydraulic pumps directly above the man's head choked on their own working pressure and let out a long, dying metallic howl. The heavy flap froze dead, mere millimeters from the critical point of collapse, locked into its grooves. The local dome system finally crashed, plunging the central core into a saving, weighty silence. The heavy silence of the central distribution hub was broken only by the dull, rhythmic crackling of cooling power cables. The air here was incredibly dry and thick with the smell of burnt insulation, melting plastic, and acrid copper dust that slowly settled onto the rusty metal floor plates. Atlas the rescuer let out a long breath through clenched teeth, slowly uncurled his numb fingers, and took one short, uncertain step back from the hopelessly jammed hydraulic gate. His breath tore from his burning lungs in short, rasping bursts, and large drops of sweat rolled down his dirty temples. The human pulled the edge of his thick protective glove off with his teeth, spat out the salty saliva, and with disobedient hands retrieved a roll of emergency medical tape from the chest pocket of his jacket. Silently, methodically, he began wrapping his forearms and faintly trembling palms, tightly bracing the overloaded, aching joints. On the dense fabric of his work clothes, right on the left shoulder, a deep indented mark from the colossal pressure of the soulless mechanism was forever imprinted. Atlas reached up with his free right hand and, with difficulty, pulled out from under his collar what remained of his old paper map. The dense printed sheet, which had served as his only reliable guide and desperate shock absorber, had finally turned into a disfigured wad of filth, soaked through with acrid sweat and blood. The rescuer clenched this useless trash tightly in his fist, shut his eyes for one long second, and then simply opened his fingers. The crushed paper slapped heavily onto the floor right beneath his ridged boots. The tool had fulfilled its final task to the very end. The alien specialist named Narshi slowly, as if in a dream, stepped back from the charred mainline panels. He stared for a long moment at the sparking wires, then dropped his head onto his narrow chest. With his long, angular fingers, he found the clasp, disconnected the thick interface cable, and tore the dead Auto-Translator unit from his clothing forever. Without the monotonous hum of the broken device, the silence in the shielded tech expansion became absolute and truly heavy. The alien's smooth skin finally lost the last remnants of aggressive or frightened patterns. It took on an even, almost transparent pale hue, indicating complete physical and nervous exhaustion. With icy clarity, Narshi understood that the direct sabotage of the dome's main energy grid had cost him his high official position and forever closed off access to the trading elites. From now on, he was as much an outcast on this station as those he had been ordered to erase. But he did not look broken. The specialist slowly raised a three-fingered hand and made a contactless gesture toward the Earthman's lowered, slumped shoulders. In that spare, direct gesture, one could read absolute professional recognition of the alien's endurance, requiring no translation into sound frequencies or complex diplomatic formulations. The rescued massive creature, with a loud scraping of claws, stepped over the scraps of melted polymer braiding. The local predator was heavily favoring its broken hind leg, its rigid, horny plates coated in a thick layer of black soot from the recent short circuit. The beast completely ignored the human and the alien specialist, walked heavily past them, and lowered itself down right at the seam of the floor plates, deliberately blocking the passage from the outer docks with his broad body. The outcast laid his massive head on his healthy front paws, but his dark, faceted eyes remained wide open, constantly scanning the thick darkness of the transit corridor. This was the first point of duty the wild predator had taken upon himself entirely voluntarily. He took over the perimeter guard, giving the exhausted group critically needed time to recover their ragged pulses. High under the arches of the technical hall, the huge, surviving monitors of the external circuit still flickered faintly. On their cracked glass, a live feed from the cameras of the main trading tiers was frozen. The heavy patrol drones, dispatched by the local leadership for a forced memory purge, synchronously turned and retreated into the dark service hangars. The harsh, secret protocol lost all logical meaning the second hundreds of local traders saw the true cause of the system failure live on the broadcast. On the wide decks of the wind market, there was no more bustle, no silent haggling, no blind panic. The enormous, motley crowd stood frozen in place. The skin of every single being present down there glowed with a single, incredibly deep dark blue color of profound, paralyzing shock. No one tried to storm the distribution core. No one demanded explanations from the guards. The traders simply retreated in silence toward the support walls of the dome, slowly clearing a wide, straight corridor. This empty path led directly from the technical hatches to the distant loading platforms, where the Earthman's encrypted courier ship stood. Narshi turned away from the fading screens. All local navigation terminals were dead, but the alien specialist held firmly in his mind the single bypass code he had managed to pull from the system a moment before its complete collapse. He stretched out his thin arm, pointing precisely toward the main airlock of the freight dock. Atlas pressed his bandaged palms against the mangled wreckage of an old cargo container and forced himself to his feet. His knees trembled finely from the strain. His spine answered with a dull, shooting pain somewhere in the lower back, but the human straightened his back through an impossibly stubborn effort. He slung the useless empty strap of his shoulder flashlight and gave a heavy nod to his companions. The trio emerged from the dense gloom of the technical levels into the open, draft-ridden space of the wind market. They moved slowly through the parted wall of dark blue figures. This local, hard-won victory looked as messy and ugly as it could possibly be. The original logistics contract was torn to shreds. The influential employers had cowardly hidden in the upper sectors to avoid answering to their own race, and not a single credit was added to the rescuer's bank account for this brutal voyage. The physical pain from holding back the multi-ton hydraulics became his only reward, one that promised to stay with the human for many months. But the secret live cargo no longer needed to be disguised as contraband ore. The massive predator limped openly beside them, making no attempt to hide his vulnerability, and ahead of them awaited the ready cryo chambers with the doomed embryos. Hundreds of witnesses followed them with long, tenacious stares, without uttering a single sound or taking a single step to intercept them. The air in the remote port dock turned out to be savingly icy. Atlas walked heavily up to the smooth hull of his courier shuttle and struck the external panel for manual pre-launch sequence with his fist. The loading ramp descended onto the ribbed deck of the hangar with a loud hiss. Narshi was the first to walk up the metal ramp, carefully guiding the wounded beast into the depths of the safe cargo hold. There, in the cool twilight of the cargo hold, the green indicators of the autonomous life support systems for the modules containing the valuable organic matter immediately lit up. The Earthman paused for a second at the very bottom. He wiped the sticky sweat and machine oil from his forehead with the soiled sleeve of his jacket and cast one last, calm glance at the dark opening of the alien dome's airlock. There was no enraged pursuit there, no thunderous applause. The human silently stepped aboard the ship and pressed the full hermetic seal button. The thick hatch clanged into place, finally closing out this contract.